Welcome everybody to day 2 of the BITSS annual meeting. Yesterday was fantastic, and we have a great lineup today. Just to remind everybody, you can find slides and other materials at the link here on the PowerPoint slide, and also our Slack channel to keep the conversation going after the sessions. Just to kind of remind people for the schedule for today, we're going to start with this panel. And Dustin, do you have the schedule slide? And then we're going to go till 9 with our keynote panel, Open Science for a More Democratic and Inclusive Scholarship. I'm going to introduce the speakers in a second. We'll have a break, and then we have parallel sessions, one session following up on the theme of this panel and a second one on publication bias. We'll move into side room discussions, then have a second panel later on this morning on advancing computational reproducibility, then some lightning talks, and then some closing and breakout. So again, I think a lot of opportunities to interact as well as to hear about some of the latest thinking and research in this area. So again, welcome back for day 2. What I'd like to do now is introduce our speakers and really just open this very important panel on inclusion in research. I think over the last couple days, it feels like in the US these days we have political crises on a kind of daily basis, but certainly this week has been another traumatic week and has caused a lot of us to reflect on the sort of nature of our society and the nature of our democratic institutions, and really just how sort of deeply seated they are. Are the values of democracy and openness and inclusion that we would hope would dominate our politics and our society, are they deeply seated values, or are they really just superficial? And one of the things that always strikes me in thinking about how we got to where we are right now politically is the question about whether we're really living our values of our democratic values of inclusion in our life more broadly beyond our sort of high level political institutions. Are we making sure to bring these values into our economic life, into the research world, into how we structure institutions other than the federal government? And I fear that far too often we haven't. And those values of inclusion and democracy and openness are really like the building blocks, or the foundation of national democracy, or foundation of political democracy. And if we don't live these values throughout our lives and our work, then we don't have a very solid foundation for our national democracy. So these are some of the issues that really are just percolating through my mind this week, given everything that's been going on in Washington, DC. And it's caused me to think again, and that was really the motivation all of us had for this panel, about how we can bring these values front and center into our lives as researchers, into the scientific community, and make sure that the values of democracy, openness, and inclusion are really central to how we organize the research sphere. So that's really just a little bit of background thinking that can maybe feed into this panel. One question that also arises in this area is whether there is a tension between some of these values and others. Is there a tension between values of open science that we treasure and values of inclusion that we also treasure, or do they reinforce each other? Are some of the classical open science norms, the Mertonian norms, or others, going to promote inclusion or hinder inclusion, or do we need to sort of augment those ideals in contemporary society and in the contemporary research sphere? So I think there's really a lot of open questions, and this is a kind of moment for us as a research community and as a society where the discussion about the interaction between open science, democracy, and inclusion is just so front and center in so many of our minds. And I can't tell you how excited I am to have such a distinguished panel here to walk us through these issues and have a bit of a discussion to make progress and to learn from each other on these issues. So let me just start with some brief introductions, and then each of our panelists will have, I think we said 5 to 7 minutes to give us an overview of their thinking on these issues. And then we're going to move into conversation, Q&A, and really, throughout the conversation for participants, please write questions in the chat, and we'll try to circle back to as many as we can later on in the session. So we're just going to, let me introduce the speakers. The first speaker will be Juan Pablo Alperin, co-director of the Scholarly Communications Lab and assistant professor at the Canadian Institute for Studies in Publishing. Juan Pablo is also associate director of research of the Public Knowledge Project at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. He's extensively studied alternative metrics for tenure and career advancement and the use of open educational tools, among other open scholarship innovations. Welcome, Juan Pablo. Our second speaker will be Antoinette Foster. She leads the PreReview's efforts to improve diversity and equity in scientific peer review through mentorship and training. She's also the director of community transformation at the Racial Equity Center at Oregon Health and Science University, where they work to address the institutional embedding of systemic racism. Additionally, Antoinette is a co-founder of a racial activism group, the Alliance for Visible Diversity in Science. The third speaker is Leslie Chan. He's director of the Knowledge Equity Lab, associate professor at the Center for Critical Development Studies at University of Toronto, Scarborough, and director of BioLine International, an international collaborative open access platform. He's been a longtime advocate for open access and inclusive scholarship. So we have an all-star lineup today, and let me start with Juan Pablo to give us his perspective. Welcome.
Great, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I want to just use my few minutes to speak, well, from my experience, both supporting researchers in Latin America and across the globe with the Public Knowledge Project, whose open source software is used by thousands of journals, and primarily from small academic journals led from universities in the Global South. Also as a researcher who has studied scholarly metrics and studied career incentives and the review, tenure, and promotion process. And also from my own personal experiences as an assistant professor who has himself navigated sort of the North American system of higher education and now just on the cusp of getting tenure. Of course, I'm happy to then speak about more. I'm going to sort of give a little bit my perspectives on some aspects about what I think about open science and its role in this, in these questions around democratic and inclusive scholarship. But I'm happy to then take the conversation. So I'll keep my remarks brief, and I'm happy to then take the conversation, and I can bring in some of the research findings and some of those the things that I've sort of have worked on from those perspectives. And so let me just start by directly sort of addressing the title of the panel. So the first thing is that I would say that I just don't believe that open science can be used for a more democratic and inclusive scholarship. So I'm just put that out there in a very sort of direct way, sort of contrary to the notion that was sort of presented in the title. But I want to say that that's at least not in the way that the term open science is commonly understood. More often than not, I hear open science talked about in the context of a set of technical practices, right? It's about sharing code, sharing data, preprints, sharing pre-registration protocols, reproducibility, and all of these sort of technical aspects of what it's like to do science. None of these practices, I think, even if we fully integrate them into our academic system, even if they are sort of become the norm and our standard, will do, I think, much to democratize or make scholarship itself more inclusive. That said, and so here on the more optimistic, or going more on the more positive side, I do think that there's an opportunity presented, and if we think about open science more broadly. And I want to say here, I prefer the term open scholarship to the term open science. I find the term using open science itself problematic, not just in its exclusion of the humanities, but also in the exclusion of other communities who are involved in knowledge production in various ways that might be considered to be non-scientific. And so you hear me sort of use my preferred term again, open scholarship, and then I'll sometimes fall back to open science just as the term that's sort of broadly understood. For me, thinking more broadly about open scholarship, I think needs to be conceived, and as a consequence, that means that open science policies and ways that we try to bring it about need to be made so that they directly grapple with the fact that academia is plagued with issues of inequality and discrimination among any number of dimensions, including racial, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and others. And on top of all of those, the epistemological discrimination that happens in the way that we organize science. I think we need to first, as we think about what role open science or open scholarship can play, we need to understand that this inequality sort of flows through academia and extends beyond the bounds of the academic institutions that we are a part of and into the public that it's supposed to serve. It extends across institutions. It's not something that we can address from our own individual place that we're standing. And it certainly extends across countries, and all the work that I've done that is more global in scope, we see how this discrimination sort of takes part and takes hold. We see it manifested, the discrimination that exists already in our academic systems, in the way that resources are allocated and whose knowledge is privileged, what type of work is welcome, and even in who is allowed to actually participate in how we do science and scholarship. And so I think that if we want to think about open scholarship as being helpful in tackling these much more obviously complex and bigger issues, we need to think of it not as a set of practices, a set of things that we are going to say that we're going to do, but rather as a mode of thinking and working that explicitly challenges some of the global politics of knowledge production, and that tackles the historical exclusion and marginalization of sort of a lot of diverse perspectives. I think open scholarship needs to be more than this set of practices, and that leave everything else about how academia functions completely unchanged, right? With institutions in the global north continuing to be at the center of knowledge production, with the power held by a certain group of individuals within those institutions. And we need to not think of it as simply a layer, that sort of openness that we tack on top of what's already there, that a layer that could be measured and then rewarded and promoted by counting, say, the number of data sets that get put online with the DOI with a Z0 license. I think open scholarship, I think in this broader definition, invites us to value other modes of working, invites us to consider modes that are less competitive and more collaborative. It invites us to think about the actors who can participate and who are the audiences and the creators of knowledge beyond the research groups that currently take part. I think in this sense, the practices that are often used to define what openness is and open science is are still welcome, but they can be seen as examples of how other modes of working can actually invite and let others participate and take part. And I think that we need to be careful not to let these sort of open science practices define what it is to be successful at doing open scholarship. I think I can sort of leave it there and pass on to the other panelists, but I think hopefully that sort of helps to open up that aspect of that dimension of how we think about open science, not as these practices, but rather as a mode of thinking that is about being open and collaborative, and about realizing that other ways of working are not only possible, but actually desirable, because if we use them to directly challenge the way that academia functions more broadly, then they can be a very useful mode of thinking and working. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Juan Pablo, for that overview of your work. And Antoinette, please take it away.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. There were a lot of really amazing points in there, so I'm very excited to have this discussion. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a few slides. So, hi everyone. My name is Antoinette Foster. I'm a trained neuroscientist. I'm a Black Latina, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I wear many hats, but today I'll be speaking to you as a program developer and the program manager of PreReview's Open Reviewers Training Program, alongside two wonderful colleagues at PreReview, Dr. Samantha Hindle and Katrina Murphy. So PreReview imagines more equitable and broader participation in peer review. We aim to address this goal in many ways, but specifically, I'm involved in the creation of the Open Reviewers Program, and I want to share our strategy and philosophy for how we aim to partially address inequities in peer review. We wanted to design a peer review training program that could extend the pool of reviewers to underrepresented groups of researchers whose expertise is measured by constructive contributions and community engagement, rather than by seniority and prestige. We also wanted to train and empower early career researchers to enter the available peer review pool and be recognized for their contributions. And when we were designing this program, we aimed to tackle several existing problems, such as the fact that the pool of reviewers is often small and homogeneous in many dimensions, that most reviewers are male, mid, or late career researchers who are opaquely selected by journal editors as experts in their field, yet most of these folks have never received any formal training in conducting constructive, and I can also add ethical peer reviews, that reviewers often go unrecognized for their contributions, that editors are typically not in network with currently available potential underrepresented reviewers. And what underlies all of this is the problem that as a system, we fail to discuss and address the ways that systemic oppression is integrated within and currently drives inequities in research. And so what we know is that many groups remain underrepresented in scholarship, including women, the racial and ethnically minoritized, people with disabilities, socially or economically disadvantaged populations, as well as entire nations. And this has compounded negative impacts for our local communities, our global community, and our collective advancement. And we cannot address this underrepresentation until we address the root cause of these various inequities. And in order to address the root cause, we must examine the way that oppressive systems, structures, and practices were created and continue to work to maintain these disparities. And these systems include, but are not limited to, patriarchal systems, white supremacist culture, and I should really just say white supremacy, heteronormativity, the practice of colonialism, especially in scholarship, and really just historically. All of these systems are connected to each other. They're all human endeavors. They are all part of who we are collectively, and they're embedded into everything that we create. And there's a common misconception that we can increase diversity and inclusion before addressing these oppressive systems, a sort of diversity before inclusion approach, but this is backwards. Increasing diversity does not address systemic oppression. It cannot address systemic oppression alone. And inclusion cannot exist alongside systemic oppression. In order to increase representation and inclusion, you start with addressing the way that these oppressive systems show up within any given space, including peer review. And since there are many reasons why specific inequities exist, we have to be very specific and targeted about our approach. Therefore, within the Open Reviewers Program, our current focus is on racial and global representation and equity specifically. We've created a training program for early career researchers with little to no peer review experience to receive training on how to ethically and constructively write manuscript reviews. Based on their level of experience, early career researchers or mentees are paired with more senior peer review researchers or mentors who act to support and guide the mentees through reviewing and publishing their manuscript reviews. Our goal is to empower mentees to become trained experts in peer review as they move through each stage. Our hope is that they come back to mentor other early career researchers to contribute to an enriched, diverse, and ethical community of peer reviewers. The Open Reviewers Program aims to address racial and global representation and inclusion within peer review by taking a multimodal approach. Our first focus is to increase access by reserving 50% of our mentee slots for racially underrepresented scientists. We also offer this program is an online and accessible training program free of charge. And I should say, when I say accessible, what I mean is accessible for those who have the resources to be able to be online, to have a computer, which is not fully accessible for everyone globally. We next address the current culture and practices, peer review practices, by providing a required mentor training that was created using a racial equity lens that focuses on systemic oppression, power dynamics, and nonviolent communication strategies. Additionally, we train all mentees on how to self-identify and address bias within their own peer review process, which I believe we're the only peer review training program to do so. And we also intentionally integrate an educational focus on the intersection between colonialism, white supremacy, and science into our training curriculum. And last, we aim to impact systems and structures. This was important because a common concern we hear from journal editors, is that they do not know early career researchers outside of their own network, and they're skeptical of their ability to adequately review. There's a lot to unpack there, but we thought that one tangible solution that we could do is not only train diverse reviewers, but we could also create a database whereby editors can identify and select qualified reviewers. Our program is an attempt at a single approach to address some parts of an inequitable system. It's imperfect and it's incomplete, and that's okay. We're in our pilot year, and we've already identified ways that we ourselves may be upholding oppression within our own program. And so our job is to remain open and flexible in order to improve. And the truth is that no one knows what equity looks like because we've never seen it. But the hope in that is that there are many creative solutions in order to address inequity. And I point this out, I think, because oftentimes what we hear is a question that I oftentimes get is, how do we do it? These problems are so big, there's not a single solution. And so there's a lot of space for creativity to address inequities. And so for those who are starting on your own journey of addressing inequities in your own system, my best advice is to allow for mistakes, to be open to feedback and change, and to always keep your eyes focused on equity. So I wanted to thank the organizers for this invitation, and I'm really looking forward to a meaningful discussion. And I will pass the mic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antoinette. That was great. And let me pass it now to Leslie for his opening comments.
Thank you, Ted, and to my fellow panelists, thank you for speaking before me. Pretty much what I wanted to say has been said by Juan Pablo and Antoinette, and I wholeheartedly agree with what they have to say. But hopefully I have some more additional points I can make that would amplify some of the points that they have already highlighted. Again, my name is Leslie Chan. I'm an immigrant from Hong Kong living in Toronto for the last 40 years. And pretty much I'm a lifetime academics at the University of Toronto. And the school on which the school occupies the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit River. I have to also confess that until really the last 10 years, I have very little understanding of the history of the meaning of the land on which a university occupies and the history of the treatment of Indigenous people by the Canadian government over the last 150 years, and the kind of systematic epistemicize, the killing of culture, ideas, and different way of knowing, and the active suppressions of different way of knowing as built into the governmental system and the educational system itself is something that we haven't been asking enough questions about. So I'm glad that these kind of conversations are happening, asking what our institutional history has been about, what they've been responsible for, how they have systematically structured and reproduced inequality, systemic racism, and how these kind of practices have been built into our system in invisible way. And Juan Pablo rightly pointed out that open science has been co-opted to be, into a narrow set of framing about the technical standards and agreements that we have to abide to, but we're not questioning actually who set up those standards in the first place. And those standards, and if you look at it, are very deeply historically embedded. Those are actually what I would call standard of whiteness. And these standard of whiteness are about what constitute academic legitimacy, what constitute academic success, what constitute legitimate knowledge. And these technical standards are encoded into our infrastructures now. So things, like Paul mentioned, DOI, ORCID, IDs, impact factors, citation counts, all these things are embedded into the infrastructures. And they are replication of a set of norms that, again, embedded in whiteness. And so I would not only question these standards, but again, we would need to think about how we need to fundamentally rethink the infrastructure of legitimacy. And that really open up the conversation about, as Juan Pablo said, we can't take for granted that somehow open science is going to solve the problem of inequity and inequality unless we address the kind of deep root of these inequity in the system itself that goes back generations and generations and have become the norm and become invisible. So let's make these visible. Let's question them. Let's tackle them. And so a lot of the debate about open science, you know, who's paying how much and all those kind of things are distractions because they're divisible. They're easy to tackle. I think the deeper question is who are making the rules, who's making the decision, who's to include, and who to include into what kind of system, and what good is it if we include people into a broken system? We just perpetuate that. And so I think I've said enough as my starting point. So I'm happy to add, you know, any comments and join in the conversation. Again, thanks for the organizers for making the space for this important conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. That was also great. So the three speakers, I really enjoyed your guys' opening comments. Before we open it up to participants and their chat, I just wanted to keep the conversation going. I'm going to ask a couple questions. A few things struck me in your talks, but I also want to know if ask you guys to think about questions you may have for each other, because I think your talks had similar themes, but there were some different points. Juan Pablo, one question for you to start. I really enjoyed your framing of the overall issues, and I was very much struck by the you know, your promotion of the term open scholarship rather than open science. I think that's actually a really valuable innovation, a valuable way of framing. This really relates to all three speakers, the notion that the way science works, the way scholarship works, the way research works is embedded in a system that's historically oppressive. One thing I wanted to ask you, Juan Pablo, is for those of us, whether it's at BITSS or other organizations seeking to make progress on issues of inclusion, I feel a real tension in what you were saying, and also Leslie, between, okay, there's a system rooted historically in values that are antithetical to equity and inclusion, but it's the system we have right now. What is something we can do in the next 2, 3, 5 years to progress? And I think this is where there's a bit of a contrast. I thought Antoinette's talk was very specific in saying, you know, identifying the systemic problems, but saying, okay, this year we're going to start training reviewers and we're going to start making progress, even though it's a small step. So I just wanted to hear a little more from Juan Pablo, maybe also Leslie, about what does the next 2, 3, or 5 years look like if we want to make progress while we seek to change the broader system. Anyway, that's a little bit of a tension I felt, and I wanted to throw it back to the panelists.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that you know, there are no easy solutions to some of these very large problems. Which is not to say, and so I wanted to. That sort of was a little bit my framing, to say that, you know, it's not as easy as saying, well, now you've got more, you put more things out there in the open, and so therefore you're making steps towards, you know, you're solving all of these very sort of systemic issues. That doesn't mean that we can't take some meaningful action. But for me, the first, like, if I was to say what is the concrete step that I think would be the most valuable, is to change the conversation a little bit around what it is that we're trying to do. So when we're having groups that are trying to promote open scholarship in different ways, is to really understand what it is that we should be trying to do with open scholarship, and not just making sure that we're very clear that we want to have a form of open scholarship that is actively working to tackle issues of discrimination and inclusion that plague academia. And if we do that, then what that means is that in, you know, some of the work I've done looking at review, tenure, and promotion practices, where we see that some of the discourse around public participation make it into review, tenure, and promotion guidelines, but then they're not actually explicitly rewarded because they haven't been absorbed as an actual value that needs to permeate everything that we do. So for me, I've sort of come around to this idea that we need to change the conversation around what it is that we're trying to do when we promote open scholarship. And so all those of us that have been trying to promote different aspects of open scholarship over the years need to start being very explicit about what is the goal that we're trying to achieve here, so that then it can be institutionalized and absorbed, and people can sort of take it on with those goals in mind.
Thanks a lot, Leslie. I don't know if you also have thoughts, if Antoinette has thoughts on that, on this issue. So Juan Pablo's point was the first thing is to change the conversation, which I think all of your work and hopefully sessions like this are pushing to change the conversation and think about open science / open scholarship in a different way and what the goals are in a more effective way. But I don't know if either of you have other thoughts.
Yeah, so I think conversation is very important, but unfortunately, I've been involved in conversation for over 20 some odd years, and we seem to be back where we started all the time. But I think the bigger problem here is really what I would say, the lack of imagination. And because, you know, academics are typically the worst in terms of being trained into a system. Once we're comfortable in that system, we feel that we have to then, you know, protect that system even. And I think this is part of the problem. And then we're in a system, as I said, it's deeply embedded in a set of norms, but these norms are also mythical norms. They're made out to be longer and stronger and more important they really are. You know, people talk about, you know, we're confronting what's going on in Washington, talk about this, some people refer to as the oldest democracy, but it is one of the mythology, isn't it? Because the real democracy doesn't really happen in the United States. One could argue that it started in '65 when everybody are given the equal right to vote. But these are all myths that we build into our system as if they're sacred. Nature came out this last summer at the height of Black Lives Matter and admit openly that Nature as a journal, as an institution, is a white racist institution, that they are responsible and culpable. 2 months later, they came out with these new policies about open access for 1,000 or 10,000 pounds if you can afford it. And so they are talking on both sides of their mouth in the sense that, okay, we admit we are racist, but we will continue to extract from the system because people like our brand. And I think this is where we need to ask ourselves, how can we imagine, can we let go of these mythologies that these institutions are what it is that we should aspire to, right? And if you look around the world, my colleagues in Latin America, in parts of Africa and Asia, they've been doing wonderful science. They've been doing wonderful research. They're doing wonderful arts. And we're just not paying enough attention to them. And if they want to be part of this conversation or part of the North American or Anglo institution, they have to conform to our system. And we ignore and make them invisible, right? Or we marginalize their scholarship. So I say, you know, it's really learning from what's already out there. Lots of fantastic things are happening already. It's just that our institution lack the imagination to include them already. It is us that we need to decenter what we already know and learn from others instead of saying we need to include them into our system, right? I think that shifting that imagination is important.
Thanks so much. Antoinette, why don't you jump in? I saw you nodding your head, and I'm sure you have a lot to add to this.
I think, just so you know, I'll nod my head to probably everything. I'm a big head nodder, so. But I wanted to actually combine the question that you asked about kind of where did we start, and another question that I see in the chat, which is, since systemic racism is a systemic problem, how can it be addressed in academia, and how realistic is it in the concept of open science? And what I want to provide, or what I want to offer, is that I think another one of these myths is that before we can solve issues of systemic racism or oppression in our own space, it needs to be solved out there somewhere else. And that's not a thing. It's not going to be solved externally until we solve it it's all the same system. Whatever we bring from the outside comes in, and whatever we do on the inside comes out. It's all the same. And so what I also want to offer is this idea that systemic oppression, pick whichever form you want, all manifest using kind of 4 basic principles. And I think when I realized this, or when I learned this, it made trying to craft solutions a little bit easier for me. And so I like to share this. And so oppression basically manifests in 2 different ways that has 2 categories underneath that. So basically, there are personal and interpersonal ways that systemic oppression manifest, which is basically who we are within ourselves and how we treat each other. This is personal and interpersonal. So this is what are those myths that we believe? What are the values that we use in practice? What are the beliefs that we have? What are the attitudes that we have? And that all drives our behavior. And that behavior is what drives how we interact with each other. And so systemic oppression can manifest in that way with who we are and how we treat each other. And then the other way that it manifests and the way that it's integrated into our system is we take who we are and we use that to construct our society. We use that to create policies, to create procedures. And this works, and oppression works in this way for everything. So you can take, let's take, I mean, a very easy one is, let's say, systemic racism and peer review. And we can take, let's say, colonialism and peer review and how that manifests. There is a belief that research coming out of, let's say, the US is superior to other nations. This is a belief that is held up through white supremacy and colonialism. That's where it was found. That's how it continues to be held up. That's a belief. That affects our attitude towards looking at research from other universities across the globe. That impacts the way that we treat each other. Because let's say that we don't even look at what other universities are producing. And so that affects the way that we treat each other. We build that into our policies. We build our attitudes into our policies by having editors only picking papers from particular institutions. That becomes a procedure and a policy that we follow. And so I think what we think is that systemic racism will get figured out there, and we don't have to fix it in-house. But the truth is that we have to fix it in-house, and we can look at those 4 modalities: personal, interpersonal, and it's really institutional and structural. Institutional and structural being the policies and procedures that we build into our society, or we build into our systems, our universities, our departments. This happens on every single level of every single system that we're involved in. And so when we're talking about addressing systemic oppression, I think we think about it as this really nebulous big thing up here, but we really just need to narrow it down to where we're at. So how does colonialism, white supremacy, heteronormativity, all of these things, how does that manifest in your small micro environment? Because what we know is that what we create in a small way happens in a big way. What we see on a small level is what we see on a large scale. And so if we can fix these issues, let's say that everyone participated in dismantling those 4 different elements of oppression in their own space, then the problem starts to become solved, right? And so we don't have to work on this huge problem up here. We can work in our small micro environments, and that's already better and really more tangible and realistic because we can design specific solutions to our own space. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that and really dispel the myth that there is no fixing the problem out there before we fix it in-house. It doesn't work that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antoinette. That was really inspiring. And I think you just stated so much more clearly than what I was trying to say up front about sort of, what we do in our own world, in our own sphere, being a building block, a foundation for building a better society. And you just stated it so well. So thank you for that. I thought that was really, really clear. I see a lot of really great comments in the chat. Let me open up, and a little bit of back and forth, which is great. Let me just unmute Fernando to make a point about open science and inclusion. I see Juan Pablo has some views on that, but maybe Fernando, you can just make your point, which you made in the chat, and we can get the response of the panelists and maybe other participants to further the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Amazing panel. It's really, it's a wake up call, literally and figuratively at 8 a.m. here. Very exciting conversation. Um, um, I I was just trying to push back a little bit in that I agreeing that there are systemic problems. And maybe it's sort of like in between Antoinette and Juan Pablo, that there are some practices on the open science community that I think that push towards open scholarship or challenging practices. I put two there that are not accepted, but I think that it's a nice direction to aspire. One is to think about requiring computational reproducibility at the working paper stage. So right now we're at the stage where published work being asked to release data and code. Why not do it at the working paper stage? Something that's very common in economics. And I think I would provide access to people in the global south at a much earlier point of the production of knowledge. Another example is the rethinking credits. So a paper, behind a paper, there are arrays, there are field workers, there's a lot of people who are involved in this production of knowledge. Why not rethinking the number of people that we give authorship? Physics is way ahead, but again, social sciences, we're still thinking in 5 as being a large number of authors. Why not 10? Why not 100? Why not 1,000 authorships behind a paper?
Go ahead, Juan Pablo.
Yeah, so what I would say is that, I mean, I'm very much in favor of us adopting a lot of these sort of open science practices. And I don't want the main message of what my sort of opening comments were to take away saying like, oh, look, these things are not worth doing. I think that what I wanted to make clear is that we shouldn't have those be the end goal and seeing, oh, now we have more of these open science practices, so we're doing science better now. And I think that that simple framing, which is what we often hear about from the open science community and open science advocates, is one that I find problematic because it doesn't begin to actually tackle the underlying issues. A very clear example for me of this, and then Leslie sort of mentioned it when we brought up the example of Nature's 10,000 euro APC, is this notion that open access, yes, it allows other people to participate in reading and participating in consuming the knowledge that's available. It opens it up so that people from outside of academia can read, people from institutions that don't have resources can read. But because it's been conceived without what is the actual underlying goal of actually trying to dismantle some of the inequality, then we have ended up with a model of open access that has been predominantly favoring APCs and protecting the business interests of open access of academic publishers. And now we've created a system of exclusion that is preventing people from participating in taking part in those conversations by publishing. And so when we adopt open science practices without the explicit goals and purposes of actually trying to address the inequalities that exist in the system, we end up with things like this. We end up with exorbitant open access fees that exclude on a different dimension. So we haven't addressed or solved the challenges in any way. We've just shifted them to somewhere else. And this happens with some of the other open science practices that you mentioned, or who's able to participate in making those things happen. If we build other open science practices into reward systems, well, it turns out people at better resource institutions who can afford to have someone help with their data curation and data management plan, those are the people that are able to share their data sets openly more easily because it doesn't tax them personally, it taxes their institutions that have resources. And now you have rewarding a practice that only the same group of people that were already privileged were able to participate in. So we need to be careful around how we adopt them. I think they can be seen, like seeing these practices implemented can be seen as a measure of success only when we are measuring them against the right values behind them.
Leslie, please jump in.
I'd like to share a document that some colleagues and I put together recently. in response to the UNESCO global consultation on open science that they're doing at the moment. Their plan, UNESCO, is to come up with this sort of universal declaration, if you will, on open science next year. And the point we made in this document is that, again, like Juan Pablo, we're not just dismissing open science, but we need to be asking important question again about who's doing the opening, for whom and by whom, and keeping in mind that, again, there's a great deal of other knowledges that we are not acknowledging. My colleagues who helped me write this paper said, 99% of the knowledge that are important for our day-to-day survival are outside of the academia. And yet we're always focused on what the academias can do in terms of research and so forth, because these are important to us as forms of legitimation. Meanwhile, we're extracting knowledge from everywhere without acknowledgement, as Fernando said. People tell us their knowledge and then we get credit for them, right? This is historically true, right? Over and over and over again. Some discipline worse than other. So much so that, knowledge are created, we benefit, and the people who we extract from are actually deprived of those knowledge, through these kind of inequitable system of knowledge distribution. So again, so for us, open science means opening up to other forms of knowing. And it is opening up to the diversity of knowings, the possibilities of other world making that will enrich us all. Because if we go on the way we do in terms of Western science, we're going to be climate disaster and we will be no more. And so I think this is really about taking advantage of what's already diverse out there, but we need to be able to open up to those different ways of knowing. So open science to us as a form of practice is really about understanding other ways of knowing and how we can all collectively benefit from multiple system, multiple world in which we can coexist.
Thanks, Leslie. That was great. I just want to reinforce your point that there's no doubt that the kind of hierarchical and elitist nature of so many, say, North American research institutions leads to this sort of pervasive lack of respect for folks who are outside the system. I think that's just a fundamental problem. And it's what you're saying, that folks who aren't trained in the system, brought up in the system, who don't have the right pedigree, there's a sort of widespread view that their voices don't matter. What could they add? What expertise might they have in our world? And I think that sort of fundamental lack of respect for other perspectives or those outside of, who are low down on the hierarchy or outside the hierarchy entirely, it's just a fundamental problem in our culture, our academic culture. So I definitely want to echo your point. Okay, there's been a lot of good comments in the chat, and I actually don't even know where to start because there's really there's a bunch. I see several comments from Adeyemi. I'm not sure if Adeyemi wants to also unmute and make a couple of the points. I know, I'm not sure if Adeyemi is in a place to unmute. If not, I can. Okay. There's a point about, okay, Adeyemi, do you want to jump in with you had several interesting comments, and please jump in.
Yeah, okay. So nice to meet you guys. So the topic you guys are addressing today is close to my heart. For the past few months, I've been working on open science. So I'm trying to build up a network of researchers in Africa, particularly. So a lot about open science, and I like the initiative. I was able to join when Antoinette, she was talking about the pre-review, and I see a lot of ideas, and I see how this can work. I was about to pose a question, because it seems to be looking at the accessibility barrier, especially in Africa. It's difficult to, like you said, is accessible. So to access this open source initiative is kind of another kind of barrier that we need to just able to overcome. And so that is kind of difficult, and I've been experiencing that. Actually, I'm in France, in University de Grenoble, where I currently am studying for my PhD. And so these are what I'm dealing with. And for me, like I said, we can build this up. We can build up network of researchers in non-Western population. I think South American is okay. They are coming up. The Asian population too is doing a little bit, but Africa has been lacking. But building up a network is important. Training, trying to allow them, then incentivize. You have to give them incentive for them to want to participate in this. And like you said, the systemic situation is about, for instance, policies of you have to become a membership, register for this and that. It's difficult for under-resourced researchers, especially in Africa. They can't pay some of these fees. So one of the things that we can do is to create policies that will allow them to integrate easily. Just a compromise to allow them to be part of the system is very, very important. And of course, like we should have open scholarship where we can encourage researchers from this, from outside the North American and European countries, and allow them maybe get access to some funds that can help move the open science forward. So a lot of ideas are coming up actually, but maybe I just share these few ones. I hope I'm able to say something that you guys can grab something from that. Okay. All right.
Thank you so much, Adeyemi. Thanks for your thoughts and adding to the conversation. There's other interesting comments in the chat. We've covered some of them actually as I look through them. But now that we have maybe 6 minutes left, and we've had some back and forth and conversation, I just wanted to make sure the panelists also have a chance to put forward any final thoughts. If you have closing remarks or anything that struck you in the chat or in the conversation, and maybe we can go in the reverse order. We'll go start with Leslie this time, then Antoinette, and then Juan Pablo. So Leslie, if you want to close with a couple minutes or any thoughts or reactions to the chat or the discussion.
So maybe a final call for actions, if I may. So one of the things that I thought I was commenting on was that a lot of the technical standards and the tools are built by a small community of people who really are replicating some of the biases and norms in the system. And it is not entirely the fault because they don't have a lot of really conversation with researchers themselves in different contexts. So I think we need to have conversation with those who design infrastructure to build the tools and so forth, to better understand the kind of values and principles that we have alluded to. How can we build these values, principle, diversity and inclusion and openness to other way of knowing into the infrastructure? Because as long as we have these very narrow set of infrastructure controlled by a very narrow set of powerful legacy players, we will be, talking this talk for years to come. So we need to have people who understand the technical side of things and help work together on building the kind of inclusive infrastructure with the value built into it from the ground up. I think those are important actions that we can take.
Thank you. Antoinette, if you can jump in.
Yeah, so first I just want to say that I'm really honored to be on a panel with the two of you. I'm just very honored by that. So I just wanted to share that. And also I wanted to actually answer a question that was in the chat that was specifically about something that I said, which was, so the question is, one could get the wrong impression that we should give up on producing more reliable science if the open science movement does not first address inclusion. Are these really trade-offs, i.e. social justice and reliable science? And what I want to say is that we can't actually achieve these values that we think of in open science without addressing inclusion. And it can't happen. We can't have open access for everyone until we address those oppressive systems, because we will always leave someone out. We will always leave groups out if we don't address those systems. And so to me, social justice and those values that we talk about that drive open science, they are addressing the systems will drive how we live out those values. I'm not saying that you should do one. I'm not saying that you should focus on dismantling oppressive systems before you focus on, or instead of focusing on the values. I mean, you cannot focus on those values. You can't achieve those values until you address the oppressive systems. So it's not really like an either or. It's more that one really is required to do the other. And you can integrate. What I would want to offer is that when we think about these values for open scholarship, when you think about access, the question that I would ask everyone is to ask access for whom? Who doesn't get it? When we think about transparency, I would want folks to think about what does transparency give us and who does it hurt? Who does it hurt? It can hurt folks. Having more transparency can help lots of problems, but it can also hurt certain vulnerable populations. And so we have to think about, until we think about the way that all of those systems are integrated, when we think about power dynamics, when we think about the manifestation of these different systems, we can really start to think critically about how we achieve those values in an equitable sense. But when we don't think about those systems, and the other panelists have already said this, but I just want to reiterate, when we don't think about those systems, what we do is we recapitulate the oppression within the goals that we're trying to reach. So we really have to think about what those systems are so that we don't continue to perpetuate the oppression. So thank you. Thank you for the invite.
Thanks so much, Antoinette. Juan Pablo, why don't you close us out?
Yeah, a lot of weight to say the final words on what has been a really good conversation. So again, thank you for allowing me to take part and to share my perspective along with my two panelists. I guess I'll finish off by just saying I also don't want to discourage people from adopting some of the open science and open scholarship practices that I'm sure are sort of on your mind as part of what the BITSS community does and is all about promoting. I really don't. I think that these conversations are sometimes challenging to have. They make us question what it is that we are doing, and they question even in some cases even challenge our identity as who we are as scholar, right? Saying like, well, I'm the kind of scholar that does open science and open scholarship, and this conversation maybe is sort of challenges and pushes back a little bit on the way that you have conceived of those things. And I realize that those things can be hard, and I don't want people to walk away necessarily with this idea that they shouldn't be encouraged to continue to try to do open science and open scholarship in different forms. What I do want people to walk away from is as you think about those practices that you're trying to adopt and you're trying to encourage others to adopt, is to first and foremost think of open scholarship as opening up to other modes of knowing and other modes of working. And if we walk away with that as the foundation of what open scholarship is, then those practices on top of that can be layered in ways that are actually constructive and supportive of having a more inclusive and democratic, just to use the terms that we have on the sort of on the panel title, as our guiding goals. So think of open scholarship first as being about those open to new ways of knowing and new ways of working, and then take those practices that you have that get used to define open science and see how those can support those broader goals. I think that's the takeaway. It's not to push you away from open science practices. It's to put a foundation underneath it that is a broader conceptualization of what open scholarship can and should be, in my opinion, about. So thank you so much to the panelists. What really inspiring thoughts, and I think there's a lot of common themes. I hope that we can save the chat and post it on OSF because there's really great links and comments and sort of new directions. So
maybe I can just lead a virtual round of applause for our three panelists here for great thinking, and thank you for really enriching our session today. That was great.